Hello again, ninth grade World Civilizations class. Today we're coming at you live from Egypt with the gift of the Nile, ancient Egypt. Today's lesson, we're going to be looking at several things including the importance of the Nile to Egyptian culture, describing the social system and religious beliefs of ancient Egypt, identifying contributions of Egyptians to science and technology, and in your digital notebook you will be defining the terms Nile River, hieroglyphics, Pharaoh, and pyramids. Take notes in your digital notebook. Let's begin with the Nile River. As you see in this map, it actually empties in the Mediterranean Sea. It flows south to north. Life, communication, and trade centered on the Nile River. It's the longest river in the world, and luckily for the Egyptians, unlike the Mesopotamian rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, it had predictable flooding. The Egyptians learned to predict when this river would flood, which helped them, 1, be safe, 2, irrigate their fields, and 3, be much more self-sufficient than Mesopotamia. Communication in Egypt is pretty famous. Hieroglyphics developed as the system of writing, usually written on papyrus, which was a type of paper made from reeds that grew near the Nile River. Originally only for record keeping, hieroglyphics then expanded to be used in tombs and in storytelling. It was used in literature, including poetry. Hieroglyphics actually were not deciphered until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. More on that later. Trade with outsiders was limited in Egypt, believe it or not. So communication with outsiders was limited. Most foreigners were regarded as enemies. Because Egypt was self-sufficient, they did not need to trade so much with outsiders. But they did have limited trade with nearby areas. For example, they traded for cedar wood in areas now in Palestine and Israel, and they traded for gold in Nubia to the south of Egypt. Now, what about this guy, Pharaoh, this king? Well, Pharaoh as a term actually doesn't develop until the newer kingdoms of Egypt. And by newer, I mean still over 3,000 years ago. But the kings of Egypt united Upper and Lower Egypt very early on in its history. As king, pharaohs were considered as a god on earth. Their responsibilities were to be a source of law and justice, carry out funerals, construct and repair any temples or tombs, and ensure that offerings were made to the gods so the gods looked favorably on Egypt. The age of the Great Pyramids, which were ordered to be built by the pharaohs, was between about 2550 and 2490 BCE, but smaller pyramids were built over the next 2,000 or so years, and they were built primarily as tombs for kings. One tomb of a king, which was not actually in a pyramid, but was instead in a place called the Valley of the Kings, was the tomb of King Tut, or Tutankhamun. And here you see on the left a museum exhibit with artifacts from his tomb, and then on the right the actually original picture when they uncovered this tomb in 1921. So they tried the best to recreate it at the museum. But this was common of kings. They were oftentimes buried with their treasures. It was believed they could carry these on to the afterlife. So let's think about those religious beliefs and the afterlife in Egypt. Egyptians, like Mesopotamians, were polytheistic. Their gods took many forms. They represented the natural world, meaning there was a god of the sun and god of the water and of the river, etc. Kings communicated with the gods, being gods themselves. And Egyptians believed in an afterlife, but they believed in a little bit of a happier afterlife than did Mesopotamians. They believed in kind of happiness, and if they were judged properly, they could go on to this happy afterlife. And for that afterlife, they would need their bodies and their possessions. So mummification, the preservation of the body before the afterlife took place, where they dehydrated the body and wrapped it and took out the organs and developed new and better technologies for doing this over the years. And most were buried with their possessions, although we have very few examples of intact tombs like Tutankhamun's, because many of these tombs had been robbed over thousands of years. Here is a scene from the Book of the Dead. In this scene, it depicts the judgment for the afterlife. What they believed was your heart would be lighter if it was a good heart. And so in this picture, the heart here is being weighed against a feather. And if it weighs less than a feather, then you could go on to the afterlife. Now, the people of Egypt were in a less structured class system than in Mesopotamia. You had the king and wealthy at the top, local leaders, officials, priests in the middle class, peasants at the bottom, and that was the majority of the population. There was slavery, but it was limited. Women, though, even though they were subordinate to men in general, could own property, divorce, control their own dowry or their goods that they received, that they gave as a gift to the husband's family for marriage. And they had overall more rights than Mesopotamians. Technology in Egypt was great. Not only did they learn a lot about chemistry and anatomy through their experiments with mummification, but they also contributed to mathematics using geometry and algebra in farming. They had the most accurate calendar in the ancient world. Of course, the pyramids were great architectural examples of what they could do. They undertook massive building projects. They used canals, not just for irrigation, but also for transporting heavy goods. The stones used in the pyramids were put on barges and moved down the Nile River to Giza. And oddly enough, the oldest known paved road in the world is located in Egypt. That's it for our notes today, guys. Keep in mind the goals. If you can do these 4 things, then you have succeeded in the video. If you cannot or are missing one of these things, well, then you might need to go rewind and watch our video again. Have a great evening, have a great weekend, and after identifying and defining these terms, you will answer the questions that have been shared with you on Moodle and Google Docs that accompany this video. Have a good weekend. Come ready to work on Monday.